Hello, my name is George Garcia, and I'm going to be responding to Mark Nakamura's claim that homosexuality is a genetically determined trait. I'm going to be refuting his claims that scientific evidence show that there are genetic differences between heterosexual and homosexual individuals, that humans are not the only beings in existence to exhibit same-sex behavior, and that opposers cite religion as their justification for calling homosexuality a choice. By demonstrating that, I'm going to be refuting these claims by demonstrating that there's little to no evidence. His claims are mostly irrelevant, and there is false support for some of his claims. His first secondary claim states that scientific evidence shows that there are genetic differences between heterosexual and homosexual people. Now, according to his argument, there is no gay gene, but the prevalence of XQ28 was found highly in 400 homosexual gay men, which were pairs of brothers. XQ28 is not a gene itself, but it's a marker on chromosome 8. And according to Alan Sanders of North Shore University Health System Research Institute, the neighboring genes around XQ28 were also found highly prevalent in the pairs of brothers. So using brothers and stating this study is highly confounding, because brothers tend to share many genes, and XQ28 was just one of the genes that they shared between the brothers. It wasn't the main homosexuality gene that was found. And also, according to Dean Hammer, who did the 1993 study of 100 gay men, more than 10% of gay men's brothers were gay, and although this demonstrates that there is a correlation, 10% isn't really a viable statistic to use in his argument, because it's basically a coincidence. It's not statistically significant in any way. And he also states that uncles and male cousins on the mother's side had a greater average chance of being homosexual, but although this is very specific, he didn't provide any evidence as to where he got this, as to how he came about this information in his argument. He just stated that this is what they found in the study. His second secondary claim was that many other animals in nature, including birds, lions, chimpanzees, dolphins, and bison, also engaged in homosexual behavior. And he never provides a source or a credible expert on where he got this information from. And although it may be, and this evidence is irrelevant, because although animals practice homosexuality in nature, it doesn't really lead you to believe that it is a genetic factor that caused homosexuality in the animals themselves. His third secondary claim states that opposers cite religion as their justification for calling homosexuality a choice. But according to Dave Massey, who is a senior researcher at PEW Research Center, 41% of scientists identify themselves as atheists. Now, if all of these scientists were somehow against homosexuality because of their religion, there would still be 41% of them who would have no religious influences at all to not present findings that they found on why genetics is involved in homosexuality, or why it's a factor in why children are inheriting it from their parents. It is because of the lack of evidence, the irrelevance of his arguments, and how many coincidences are present that I urge you to accept my refutation of Mark's speech that homosexuality is a genetically determined trait.
Well, I think the idea of arguing that the assumptions in the argument are problematic and that there's not sufficient proof on them is reasonable, instead of trying to take a counter position and argue the opposite. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to get confused about XQ28 by the end of the evening because this is like the second or third time we've heard about this. I thought on the first point where you talked about the markers, you kind of explain a little bit about how this was being utilized to make the inference that there's a genetic relationship, but then you suggest that they aren't really genes and that there is a problem with the nature of the brother comparison that was being made. I didn't understand your criticism of the brother comparison that was being made, so I think that doesn't help your argument as much as it could. The second piece of information that you had there that suggested that there was only 10% likelihood in that situation, and that's at best a correlation. It's certainly not any greater than you would get by coincidence or accident. I thought that was a clearer argument on that particular point. I also appreciated the fact that you challenged the lack of evidence that the advocate cited, or excuse me, not the lack of evidence, but the lack of sourcing on some of the information that was being presented. So in essence, the advocate's using information to support their conclusion that is not validated in some way. I think that's a reasonable press to make. On the animal argument, you say the advocate provides no sources. That's fine. If there's no experts that suggest that, that's fine. I think your better argument is that it doesn't necessarily demonstrate that it's a genetic relationship. It might just be a characteristic. It could be situational context. I don't know. There's not really a lot of explanation of it in either direction. I think you've got the right argument here by simply asking the question, well, how does that prove that there is in fact a genetic connection here? The advocate doesn't explain that. And then on your last point, it's kind of an interesting way to go with the argument to suggest that, look, there are a whole bit, the idea that homosexuality isn't caused by genetics is really a result of people who have religious biases and prejudice. And you say, well, 41% of scientists are atheists. They don't have those religious biases and prejudices. So why wouldn't they be willing to present this kind of information if they had it? You know what? That's at least a reasonable challenge to the point, and I'm not sure that the advocate presented any evidence to support their position on this issue. So, I think that's an interesting argument. I'm not sure that it's convincing, but if I was contrasting it to the argument the other side was making, I'd say, okay, that sounds reasonable. Thank you.